Right now, you carry a small glass screen that lets your voice leap across the whole world in an instant. We call its great-grandfather the telephone, and everyone knows the famous name behind it. But years before that famous patent, a poor Italian immigrant was already speaking into a wire in a small wooden house to the one person he loved most. He built the future with his own hands, and he would die penniless, forgotten, insisting to his last breath that it had been stolen from him. Some people change the world, and the world never learns their name. This is without whom. His name was Antonio Meucci. He was born in Florence, Italy, in 1808, the son of a modest family. As a boy, he was endlessly curious, drawn to machines and to the strange, invisible force called electricity. He studied chemistry and engineering at a fine arts academy, and everywhere he looked, he saw problems waiting to be solved. He was clever, restless, and certain the world could be made better. To make his living, young Antonio went to work backstage at a grand opera house, building the machinery that made the magic happen. And there, among the costumes and the lamplight, he met a kind young woman named Esther, who sewed the dresses for the stage. They fell in love and married. Through every triumph and disaster, Esther would be at his side. Seeking a better life, Antonio and Esther sailed across the sea to Havana in Cuba. There he became the chief engineer of a great theater, and his mind caught fire. He tinkered, he experimented, he invented. He found new ways to coat metals and to purify water. He was becoming known as a brilliant man who could bend electricity to his will. And then, one ordinary day, he stumbled onto something astonishing. In those days, some doctors believed gentle jolts of electricity could ease a person's pain. Antonio was treating a man this way, with a small copper wire, when the man suddenly cried out. And in that instant, Antonio felt the man's voice travel up the wire and into his own ear. He froze. He had just heard a human voice carried along a thread of metal. The year was 1849. Think about how impossible that was. At the time, the most advanced machine on Earth could send only clicks and taps down a wire in a code of dots and dashes. But Antonio had glimpsed something far greater. What if you could send the living human voice itself, the laughter and the warmth, across any distance? It was a dream decades ahead of its time. The famous Belle was still a small child. Antonio carried that dream with him to America. He and Esther settled on Staten Island, near New York, in a small wooden house. To pay the bills, he built a little factory making candles. But every spare hour and every spare coin went into his real obsession. In a humble workshop, he set out to do what no one had ever done, to build a machine that could carry a human voice. He was not entirely unknown. For a time, one of the most famous men in the world lived under his roof, a celebrated Italian revolutionary named Garibaldi, hiding in exile far from home. Together, the two men hunted and fished and made candles to survive. But while his famous houseguest would be remembered by history forever, Antonio was about to be erased from it. Then sorrow came to the little house. Esther fell gravely ill, her body twisted by a cruel disease, until she could no longer leave her bed upstairs. Day after day she lay alone in her room, while Antonio worked below, aching to be near her. And out of that ache, out of pure love, came the idea that would one day change the world. Antonio ran a wire from his workshop all the way up to Esther's bedroom and fitted each end with a small device of his own making. Now, whenever he wished, he could speak, and his voice would travel up the wire and into her room. a husband and wife, talking across their house, through metal and electricity. It was, in every way that matters, a telephone, born of love. And he did not stop there. Over the years, Antonio built dozens of versions of his talking machine, refining them. He sketched his designs, he kept careful notebooks, and he even staged a public demonstration, sending a famous singer's voice down the wire to amazed listeners. He knew with total certainty what he was holding in his hands. He was holding the future, but knowing it was not enough. Antonio was a poor immigrant who spoke broken English, and the rich men of New York would not listen to him. He begged for investment and was turned away. Prejudice closed door after door. The greatest invention of the age sat in a workshop on Staten Island, and no one with money or power would come to see it. Then fate struck a terrible blow. In 1871, Antonio was crossing the water to Staten Island when the boiler of the ferry boat exploded. Scalding steam tore through the passengers, and many were killed. Antonio was burned so badly that he lay near death in a hospital bed for months, and while he suffered there, his family had no money at all. So, to keep food on the table, his sick wife did the only thing she could. She gathered up Antonio's precious machines, the original models of his talking device, the work of 20 years, and sold them to a junk dealer for $6. When Antonio came home and learned they were gone, it must have broken something inside him. But he refused to give up. Slowly, Antonio rebuilt. With a few partners, he tried at last to protect his invention, but a full patent cost $250, a fortune he simply did not have. So he could only afford a cheaper, temporary claim, a kind of placeholder. The lawyer who wrote it up rushed the job in half an hour and left out the most important details. Still hopeful, Antonio handed a description of his invention to a powerful telegraph company, begging them to test it on their lines. He waited. Weeks became months. Months became 2 long years. And when he finally demanded his papers back, they told him that everything had been lost. He could no longer spare even the small fee to keep his claim alive. Quietly, it expired. And then, in 1876, it happened. A young, well-funded inventor named Bell was granted the patent for the telephone. The credit, the fame, and soon the fortune all flowed to another man. Years later, an official would admit that if only Antonio's claim had still been alive, no such patent could ever have gone to Bell. But by then, it was far too late. Antonio did not stay silent. He fought, writing letters, telling anyone who would listen that the invention was his. The case grew so serious that the government itself moved to overturn the famous patent. But the battle dragged on for years, buried in delay. And in the end, a court ruled against the old immigrant, dismissing his life's work as little more than a toy. And so Antonio Meucci died in 1889, old and penniless, in the same small house on Staten Island. To the very end, he held to one quiet, unshakable truth. The telephone, he said, was the thing he had invented and first made known, and which had then been stolen from him. Then the world moved on and forgot that he had ever lived at all. But the truth has a way of surviving. More than 100 years later, the United States Congress passed a resolution honoring Antonio Meucci and his work in the invention of the telephone. Today, his little house is a museum, and his name is spoken again at last. So the next time you hear a loved one's voice cross a wire, remember the poor inventor who first sent his voice up the stairs to the woman he loved. The world you live in was built by people you have never heard of. And now, you know one more name. Antonio Meucci. Like and subscribe and stick around because the textbooks left a lot out. Thanks for watching.